There's a key. Maybe you can still picture it. Small, metal, worn at the edges from being handled so many times. You wore it around your neck, or tucked it into your backpack pocket, or kept it clipped to a zipper. And every afternoon, when the school bell rang, and the other kids were met at the gate, or walked home in groups, or climbed into the back seats of cars driven by someone who loved them, you walked home alone. You unlocked the door yourself. You let yourself in. And the house was quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Not the kind of quiet that feels like rest. The kind of quiet that has a texture to it, a weight. The kind of quiet that a child's nervous system registers not as safety, but as absence. You made your own snack. You turned on the television because the sound of voices, even fictional ones, was better than nothing. You did your homework, or you didn't. You handled whatever came up. A scraped knee, a bad day, a nightmare that followed you home from school and had nowhere to go because there was no one there to tell it to. You figured it out. That's what you were supposed to do. That's what everyone said you were so good at. Figuring it out. And here's what no one ever told you. Here's the thing that got buried under all that praise for your independence and your toughness and your self-sufficiency. What you were doing every single afternoon in that quiet house was not thriving. You were surviving. And there is a profound, life-altering difference between those two things that took most of you decades to even begin to understand, if you ever did at all. This video is for Generation X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980. The generation that came after the boomers and before the millennials and somehow managed to be overlooked by almost everyone in between. The generation that was handed a house key and told in so many words that needing people was a problem, that wanting comfort was weakness, that asking for help was an imposition, that the highest virtue a person could possess was the ability to handle their own life without burdening anyone else with it. And if that sounds familiar to you, if something in you just quietly recognized itself in those words, then I want you to stay with me. Because what we're going to explore today is not just the sociology of a generation. It's the psychology of a wound that was inflicted not with cruelty, but with neglect, not with malice, but with absence, and a wound that, for many of you, is still shaping how you move through the world right now, today, in ways you might not even be fully aware of. Let's start at the beginning, because to understand the psychology of Generation X, you have to understand the world they were born into, and more specifically, the world their parents were navigating. The parents of Gen X were largely members of the silent generation and the early baby boomers. They came of age in the post-war era, a time defined by conformity and economic expansion, and a very particular set of values around what it meant to be a good parent, a good provider, a good American. Emotional expressiveness was not high on that list. Stoicism was. Hard work was. Keeping your feelings to yourself and getting on with it was the highest form of maturity available. These were people who had grown up in the shadow of the Great Depression and World War II, either directly or through the stories and silences of their own parents. They knew in their bones what real hardship looked like, and many of them consciously or not, carried the belief that preparing their children for the world meant toughening them up, meant not coddling them, meant letting them encounter difficulty and discomfort so that when the real difficulties came, they would be ready. There was love there. Let's be clear about that. There was genuine love in many of those households, but love expressed through provision rather than presence. Love expressed through working long hours to put food on the table, not through sitting on the floor and asking how your day was. Love that was real, but that often didn't know how to speak the language that children actually need love to speak. And then, in the 1970s and into the early 1980s, something else happened. The divorce rate in America climbed to its highest point in recorded history. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, which was a social revolution with profound positive implications for gender equality and economic independence, and also a social revolution that left a practical gap in the lives of millions of children who now came home to empty houses. Single-parent households multiplied, blended families became common. The structure of the American family was changing rapidly, and the cultural conversation about what children needed emotionally had not yet caught up. And so, a generation of children came home to empty houses. They were given keys and told they were responsible. They were praised for not needing things. They were called mature. They were called independent. And the message, absorbed not through any single dramatic moment, but through thousands of quiet afternoons of aloneness, was this: your needs are not the priority here. You can handle this. Don't make it harder for everyone by needing more. If this is resonating with you, if you're finding language here for something you've carried a long time, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more people find conversations like this one. Now let's keep going. Psychologists have a term for what many Gen X children experienced in those years. They call it emotional neglect. And it's important to understand what that means, because emotional neglect doesn't look like abuse. It doesn't leave visible marks. It's not the presence of something harmful. It's the absence of something necessary. The absence of a attunement, which is the experience of being seen and understood by a caregiver. The absence of co-regulation, which is the process by which a child learns to manage their own emotions by first experiencing a calm, regulated adult helping them through difficult feelings. The absence of consistent emotional presence, which is the foundation upon which a child's sense of security and self-worth is built. When those things are absent, children don't simply adapt and move on. Their nervous systems adapt. Their attachment systems adapt. Their entire internal model of what relationships are, what they can expect from other people, what it means to need something, adapts to reflect the reality they've been given. And the reality that many Gen X children were given was, you are on your own. The people who love you have other things to attend to. Needing them is a burden. Handling it yourself is the only reliable option. That adaptation is not weakness. Let's be absolutely clear about that. That adaptation was intelligence. It was survival. A child who learns not to need things from people who cannot provide them is a child who is protecting themselves from repeated disappointment. A child who learns to be self-sufficient is a child who found a way to function in the absence of what they needed. That's not a character flaw. That's resilience in its most raw and unpolished form. But here's what makes this so complicated. Here's the part that takes decades to unpack, if it ever gets unpacked at all. The strategies that kept you safe as a child don't automatically update when you become an adult. The nervous system doesn't get a memo that says the situation has changed, that you are now 35 or 45 or 55 years old, and the people in your life are not your emotionally unavailable parents, and it is actually safe now to need things. The nervous system keeps running the old programming. The old programming that says, handle it yourself, don't be a burden. Asking for help is weakness. Needing people is dangerous. And so you do. You handle it yourself. You have been handling it yourself for so long that you have become genuinely extraordinary at it. You are competent in ways that leave other people slightly in awe. You can navigate a crisis with a kind of calm pragmatism that looks, from the outside, like unshakable strength. You don't fall apart. You don't ask for things. You figure it out. And underneath all of that, if we're being honest, if we're really being honest, there is often a kind of loneliness that is so old and so familiar that you might not even recognize it as loneliness anymore. It just feels like the background hum of being alive. It feels like normal. It feels like this is just who you are. This person who doesn't really need people, who is fine on their own, who has always been fine on their own. But you weren't fine. You were a child in a quiet house, and you needed someone to come home to, and they didn't. And you learned to be fine, because what other choice did you have? There's a concept in attachment theory called the avoidant attachment style, first described by the British psychologist John Bowlby, and later expanded by Mary Ainsworth through her landmark Strange Situation studies in the late 1960s and early 1970s. What Ainsworth found, through observing how young children responded when separated from and reunited with their caregivers, was that children whose caregivers were consistently unavailable or emotionally dismissive developed a particular pattern of relating. They appeared independent. They didn't cry much when the caregiver left. They didn't rush to them when they returned. They seemed, on the surface, to be fine. But when researchers measured the stress hormones in these children's bodies, they found something important. These children were not actually calm. Their bodies were registering significant stress. They had simply learned to suppress the outward expression of that stress, because expressing it had proven, through experience, to be futile. No one came when they cried. No one attuned when they reached out. And so they stopped reaching out. They learned to manage the feeling internally, invisibly, alone. Does that sound familiar? The avoidant attachment style, in its adult form, shows up as a deep discomfort with emotional dependency, a tendency to withdraw when relationships get too close or too emotionally demanding, a preference for self-reliance over vulnerability, difficulty asking for help, not because you don't need it, but because some part of you, some very old and very tired part of you, is still waiting to be disappointed by the asking, still braced for the moment when the person you reach toward turns out not to be there. And here's what research consistently shows about people with avoidant attachment patterns. They don't experience less emotional pain than other people. They experience just as much. They simply have become expert at not showing it, and over time, at not fully allowing themselves to feel it either. There is a kind of emotional compartmentalization that happens, a learned ability to put the feeling in a box and close the lid and get on with what needs to be done. And it works. It works remarkably well in the short term, and it costs enormously in the long term, in the form of relationships that never quite reach the depth you might secretly want, in the form of a body that carries tension. It was never given permission to release, in the form of a persistent, low-grade sense of isolation that follows you even into rooms full of people who love you. Because here's the invisible truth about emotional self-sufficiency, the kind that was trained into you rather than chosen by you. It doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like a glass wall. You can see the warmth on the other side. You can be right next to it. But there's something between you and it that you don't quite know how to move through. I'd love to know where you are in this. If there was a moment when you first recognized this pattern in yourself, or a relationship where you noticed the glass wall for the first time, share it in the comments. You don't owe anyone your story, but this community is made richer when people do. Let's talk about another dimension of this, because the psychology of Gen X is not just about attachment. It's about identity, about what happens to a generation that was, in many ways, culturally invisible. The baby boomers were a phenomenon. 76 million of them, born in the post-war boom, they reshaped every institution they moved through simply by virtue of their numbers and the cultural attention those numbers commanded. They had Woodstock and Vietnam and the civil rights movement and the cultural revolution of the 1960s. They were, and have remained, the defining generation of the 20th century in the American cultural imagination. And the millennials, when they came along, became the subject of endless cultural fascination and debate. Are they lazy? Are they entitled? Are they saving the world or destroying it? They were analyzed, criticized, celebrated, and studied with an intensity that reflected just how much cultural attention was being paid to them. Gen X, sandwiched between these two cultural giants, was largely ignored. They were too small in number to command the demographic attention the boomers received. They came of age before the internet made every generation's experience instantly visible and loudly narrated. They were the generation that grew up in the cultural gap between the idealism of the 60s and the excess of the 80s, inheriting a world that felt, in many ways, disillusioned. The optimism had curdled, the institutions had failed, the family had fractured, and no one was particularly interested in making a documentary about it. Douglas Copeland named the generation in his 1991 novel, and the name itself says something. Generation X, the unknown variable, the generation without a defining characteristic, or rather, the generation whose defining characteristic was the absence of a defining characteristic, the blank space between the movements. And what does it do to a person to grow up feeling culturally invisible, to be the generation that no one is writing think pieces about, that no one is making films for, that exists in the cultural conversation primarily as a footnote between two louder stories. It reinforces something that was already being reinforced at home, in those quiet houses by those absent afternoons. The message that you are not the priority, that your experience is not particularly interesting or important, that you should not expect to be seen. There is a psychological concept called chronic invisibility, and while it's most often discussed in the context of marginalized identities, it applies here in a generational sense. When a person or a generation consistently receives the message that their experience is not worth attending to, they internalize that message. They begin to believe it. They stop expecting to be seen, and eventually they stop trying to be seen. And eventually they develop a kind of wry, ironic detachment from the whole project of being seen, because irony is the armor you build when sincerity has been too consistently met with indifference. This is, in many ways, the cultural signature of Generation X. The irony, the cynicism, the refusal to be earnest, the dark humor, the ability to see through the performance of things, to recognize the gap between what is promised and what is delivered, and to respond to that gap not with outrage, but with a kind of sardonic shrug. Because outrage requires believing that things should be different, and believing that things should be different requires a certain kind of hope. And hope, for a generation raised on disappointment, is a vulnerable thing, a dangerous thing, a thing that has gotten you hurt before. Kurt Cobain understood this. So did the writers of Dazed and Confused, of Reality Bites, of Singles, of the films and music that Gen X made about itself in the early 1990s, when it briefly had a cultural moment. There was something underneath the slacker aesthetic, underneath the flannel and the distortion pedals and the ironic detachment. That was not indifference. It was grief. It was the grief of a generation that had been promised something by the culture and the family and the institutions around it, and had received something very different, and had developed the emotional intelligence to see that clearly, but not quite the cultural support to process it fully. And here's what makes this so difficult to understand. Because Gen X was not given the language for that grief, they were not a generation that was encouraged to go to therapy or talk about their feelings or name their emotional experiences with any precision. They were a generation that was encouraged to get on with it, to not be so sensitive, to toughen up. And so the grief went underground. It became the background hum. It became the irony. It became the competence and the self-sufficiency and the quiet, persistent sense that you are fundamentally on your own in this world. And that is just the way things are. What finally gave you permission to feel differently about any of this? Was there a moment, a conversation, a book, a relationship that cracked something open? I'd genuinely like to know, and so would the people reading alongside you in the comments. Let's talk about what this looks like in adult relationships, because this is where the childhood wound tends to make itself most clearly felt. Many Gen X adults carry a very specific and very painful relational pattern. They are extraordinarily capable of showing up for other people. They are often the friend who comes through in a crisis, the partner who handles the logistics, the family member who manages the practical dimensions of difficulty without complaint. They give well. They are competent givers. But receiving is another matter entirely. Receiving requires vulnerability. It requires the ability to say, I need something. I am struggling. I cannot handle this alone. And for someone whose entire psychological architecture was built around the premise that needing things is dangerous, that asking is an imposition, that the people you love most might not come through when you reach out, receiving can feel almost physically uncomfortable. There is a kind of internal alarm that goes off when someone offers help, when someone tries to take care of you, when someone sees that you are struggling and moves toward you. The alarm says, this is not safe. This is not how things work. Do not let yourself need this, because needing it means you could lose it, and losing it will be unbearable. And so you deflect. You say you're fine when you're not. You minimize what you're going through. You turn the conversation back to the other person. You make a joke. You handle it. You disappear into competence, because competence is the one thing that has never let you down, the one thing you know you can rely on, the one thing that doesn't require you to trust anyone else with the more fragile parts of yourself. Psychologists call this compulsive self-reliance, a term that comes out of John Bowlby's later work. And what's important to understand about compulsive self-reliance is that it is not the same thing as healthy independence. Healthy independence is a choice. It comes from a secure foundation, from the knowledge that you could ask for help if you needed it, that the people in your life would respond, and that choosing to handle something yourself comes from preference rather than fear. Compulsive self-reliance is not a choice. It's a reflex. It's the automatic reaching for self-sufficiency, not because you prefer it, but because some part of you genuinely cannot believe that the alternative is available to you. And the cost of that reflex over a lifetime is significant. It shows up in marriages where one partner handles everything and slowly, quietly begins to resent the weight of it, not because their partner isn't willing to help, but because they cannot bring themselves to ask. It shows up in friendships that stay at a certain comfortable surface level, where there is warmth and loyalty and shared history, but never quite the depth of real mutual vulnerability. It shows up in a relationship with yourself, in the way you push through exhaustion and illness and grief and difficulty without ever quite giving yourself permission to stop and be taken care of, even by yourself. It shows up in the body too, because the body keeps score, as the trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk has so powerfully articulated. The body keeps score of every feeling that was never allowed to be expressed, every need that was suppressed, every moment of reaching out that was met with absence. It keeps that score in the form of chronic tension, in the shoulders that never quite release, in the jaw that clenches at night, in the stomach that tightens in moments of intimacy or vulnerability, in the persistent, low-grade anxiety that you might have simply come to accept as your baseline, as just how you are, not recognizing that it is the accumulated record of a nervous system that learned very early that the world was not reliably safe. And here's something important to name, something that often gets missed in conversations about Generation X. Many of you are now in your 40s and 50s and early 60s, you are at a stage of life that carries its own particular weight. You are, many of you, caring for aging parents while raising children or navigating empty nests. You are at the midpoint or past the midpoint of your working lives. You are encountering your own mortality in ways that feel more immediate than they once did. You are, in short, at a life stage that demands a great deal emotionally, and you are navigating it with the emotional toolkit of someone who was never really taught how to ask for what they need. And the cultural conversation, as ever, is not particularly interested in how you're doing. The think pieces are about boomers refusing to retire and millennials struggling with housing costs and Gen Z navigating mental health crises in the digital age. And Gen X is, as it has always been, somewhere in the middle, handling it, figuring it out, not making a fuss. But here's what I want to say to you, directly and without any softening. You are allowed to make a fuss. You are allowed to have needs. You are allowed to struggle and say so. You are allowed to reach out and ask and receive and be taken care of. Not because you've earned it through sufficient suffering, not because you've proven yourself capable enough to deserve it, but because you are a human being, and those things are not rewards for good behavior. They are the basic conditions of a life lived in genuine connection with other people. The key around your neck was not a badge of honor. It was a symbol of something that should have been different. And the fact that you survived it, that you built a life and a self and a set of competencies out of those quiet afternoons is genuinely remarkable. But survival is not the ceiling. Understanding is not the ceiling. The ceiling is something more like flourishing. And flourishing requires something that survival does not. It requires letting yourself be known. There's a concept that the researcher and author Brené Brown has spent her career articulating, which is that vulnerability is not weakness, that the willingness to be seen, to let someone know what you actually need, to risk the possibility of disappointment in service of the possibility of genuine connection, is one of the most courageous things a human being can do. And for Gen X, for a generation that was trained to read vulnerability as weakness, that was taught through experience that expressing need leads to disappointment, that reframing is not a small thing. It is a profound and difficult and necessary thing. Because here's what the research on human connection consistently shows. The quality of our relationships is the single most powerful predictor of our well-being over a lifetime. Not our income, not our achievements, not our ability to handle things. The Harvard study of adult development, one of the longest longitudinal studies of human life ever conducted, followed hundreds of people for over 80 years and found that the people who aged best, who were happiest and healthiest in their later years, were the people who had cultivated warm, close, mutually vulnerable relationships. Not the people who had been most self-sufficient, not the people who had handled the most, the people who had let themselves be known and had known others in return. And that finding is not a condemnation of anyone who has struggled with this. It is an invitation. It is the research saying, in the gentlest possible way, that it is not too late, that the patterns laid down in childhood are not permanent sentences, that the nervous system, even an adult nervous system, even a middle-aged nervous system that has been running the same protective programming for 40 or 50 years, retains the capacity to learn something new, to update, to find slowly and imperfectly and with real effort that it is possible to reach out and be met, that not everyone will disappoint you, that need is not the same as weakness, that asking is not the same as burdening. This is what psychologists call earned security, the process by which an adult who did not receive secure attachment in childhood develops it through experience, through therapy, through relationships that consistently demonstrate that they can be trusted, through a gradual, often non-linear process of learning to tolerate the vulnerability of being known. It is not quick, it is not easy, it does not erase the history, but it is real, and it is possible, and it is happening for people every day. And there's something else worth naming here, something that speaks specifically to the cultural experience of Gen X, the cynicism and the irony and the detachment that became your generational signature. Those are not character flaws. They are not signs of emotional immaturity or arrested development. They are the entirely understandable responses of a generation that was burned by sincerity, that watched the idealism of the generation before them curdle into self-absorption, that grew up in the rubble of failed promises and learned to protect itself by never quite believing in things too completely. But cynicism has a cost, and the cost is that it keeps you at a safe distance, not just from disappointment, but from joy, from genuine enthusiasm, from the experience of caring about something so much that it makes you vulnerable, from the particular kind of aliveness that comes from letting something matter to you all the way, without the protective buffer of ironic distance. And many of you know this. Many of you, in the quieter moments, feel the cost of the armor, feel the particular loneliness of being someone who is very good at surviving and not quite sure how to do anything else. Feel the gap between the life you are living and the life you might live if you could figure out how to want things openly, how to need things without shame, how to let people in past the competent, self-sufficient surface that you have spent a lifetime perfecting. That gap is not a sign that something is wrong with you. That gap is the distance between the child you were, alone in a quiet house with a key around their neck, and the adult you have become, who has survived things that child could not have imagined, and who deserves, genuinely deserves, to stop surviving quite so hard and start living a little more fully. Let me say something about therapy, because it's relevant here, and because Gen X has a complicated relationship with it. Many of you grew up in households where therapy was not discussed, or was discussed with suspicion or contempt, where going to therapy meant something was seriously wrong with you, where the expectation was that you handled your own problems privately without involving strangers in your interior life. And even for those of you who have found your way to therapy as adults, there can be a particular Gen X flavor to the experience, a tendency to intellectualize rather than feel, to understand the pattern rather than sit with the emotion beneath it, to be a very good therapy patient in the cognitive sense, while keeping the more vulnerable, more frightened, more needing parts of yourself at a careful distance, even from the therapist. If that's you, that's okay. That's not failure. That's the pattern doing what it was built to do, protecting you. And the work, the slow and often uncomfortable work, is not to destroy the protection, but to gradually expand the window of what feels safe. To practice, in small ways, the experience of being known and not abandoned, of needing something and having it provided, of reaching out and being met. Each time that happens, each time the nervous system registers that reaching out did not lead to disaster, the old programming updates a little. The window widens a little. The glass wall becomes a little more permeable. And it doesn't have to be therapy, though therapy can be extraordinarily valuable for this kind of deep relational rewiring. It can be a friendship where you practice saying one true thing about how you're actually doing. It can be a partnership where you practice asking for one thing you need instead of handling it yourself. It can be a moment of letting someone take care of you, really take care of you, without deflecting or minimizing or making a joke. It can be the practice of sitting with your own feelings long enough to name them, which is itself a radical act for someone who learned that feelings were things to be managed rather than experienced. It can be, in some small and private way, acknowledging to yourself that the child in that quiet house deserved better, not as a condemnation of your parents, who were themselves navigating their own wounds with the limited tools they had been given, not as a rehearsal of grievance, but as an act of honesty, as the beginning of a different relationship with your own history and your own needs and your own right to take up space in the emotional lives of the people who love you. Because here's the thing about Gen X that often gets missed in the cultural conversation, in the rare moments when the cultural conversation notices Gen X at all. You are not a generation of people who don't feel things. You are a generation of people who feel things very deeply and were never given adequate support for that depth of feeling, and who developed extraordinary skill at managing that depth privately, invisibly, alone. The feeling was always there. The capacity for it was always there. What was missing was the permission, the language, the witness. And that is what I want to offer here. In whatever small way a video can offer such a thing. The witness, the acknowledgement that what you experienced was real and that it shaped you in ways that are understandable, and that the strategies you developed to survive it were intelligent and necessary, and that they have also, over time, cost you things that you deserve to have. Connection, rest, the experience of being held rather than always being the one who holds, the experience of reaching out and finding someone there. You are not too old for this. You are not too far gone. You are not too set in your ways, or too cynical, or too damaged. You are a person who learned very early to be alone, and who has been alone in certain fundamental ways for a very long time, and who deserves at this stage of life to find out what it feels like to not be quite so alone anymore. The key around your neck was real. The quiet house was real. The afternoons of figuring it out alone were real. And the wound that came from all of that is real too, even if it has no visible mark. even if no one ever named it, even if you yourself have spent decades not quite believing it was real, because you survived it, and surviving it was supposed to mean it was fine. It wasn't fine. You were a child who needed more than you were given. And that is not a weakness to admit. That is not self-pity. That is simply the truth. And the truth, even when it's painful, has a particular kind of power. The power to begin something, to open something, to make possible, slowly and imperfectly, something that was not possible before. You figured it out then. You will figure this out too. But maybe, this time, not entirely alone. If this video found someone you know, someone who grew up in a quiet house and never quite had language for what that did to them, consider passing it along. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for another person is hand them the words they've been missing. That act of sharing costs almost nothing and can quietly change everything for someone who needed to feel less alone in this. If this video found you at the right moment, if something in it named something you've been carrying, without language for it, I hope you'll stay with this channel. There's more here for you, more conversations like this one, more attempts to see the hidden landscapes of human experience clearly and speak about them honestly. And if you feel safe doing so, I'd invite you to share something in the comments. Not because you owe anyone your story, but because somewhere out there is another person who grew up in a quiet house with a key around their neck, and they might need to know they're not alone. Your voice could be the thing that tells them that. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being willing to sit with something this real.